they've actually begun. Well, just here's a little insight that I thought of, because we're going to go into a rather bad time period with the Jews of Spain. And believe you me, there were delegations and people tried to speak on behalf of the Jewish people, to try to nullify decrees that will be issued against them. And I think to myself, all right, we're approaching the story of Purim. So in that case, it was a woman, though, who approaches the king, and he listens to her. Now, let's, understand, though, Ahasuerus was obviously infatuated with Esther, because why else is he, listening to her? And also, I don't think he really liked Haman. I think he, I felt he was started trying to push his way in. Remember when the king says, "Oh, how do you honor somebody, who's done such wonderful things, for on behalf of the ruler?" And then, you could see from the way he's talking, to put the crown on his head, blah, blah, blah. So I think it's, maybe we have to thank Ahasuerus, even the focus is on Esther. And I think to myself that maybe all these time periods where the Jews have gone through such terrible things, maybe they should have put up a woman to go to speak. Especially, when we're going to come to the latter part, prior to the expulsion, the woman would have been a better person to talk to Isabella. I mean, I don't know, I'm just guessing, but maybe one woman listening to another, maybe somehow some sympathies would have, risen to the fore, in Isabella's heart. Who knows? But I certainly feel with the story of Queen Esther, it's not just that she was this eloquent spokesperson, or how she maneuvered, but she really, it was because Ahasuerus, as I say, was so infatuated with her. So when, he finds out, Haman, who's also invited to the party, he must have been a little resentful. What the heck is this guy doing at this nice little tete-a-tete we're having, And then she discloses, oh my God, this guy, has convinced you, that all the Jews should be totally destroyed. And and I myself am, from that people. So whatever, I just found interesting, especially as I'm now doing, what's happening with Spanish Jewry. And that there wasn't and believe you me, I'm sure so many of these Rabbanim or leaders, were eloquent themselves, but they obviously did not get any emotional response. And that's why, all the awful promulgations came to be. Okay, so I think I will begin now. So I'm going to just sort of conclude a bit with like the end of the 13th century, then we're going to go primarily now into the 14th and the 15th century. One of the sources I use actually is Rabbi Wine's book. And I was so amazed as I was preparing. Remember, you have it also. Okay, so when I started talking about, we were talking about the Jews of France and Germany, I said how horrible that 14th century was, and that was the time of the Black Plague and just all these horrendous things. And then I was reading his book, and when he's now talking about the Jews of Spain, and he was saying also how the 14th century was this terrible century, so it was for the Jews of Ashkenaz and the Jews, the Sephardic Jews as well. This was just a terrible thing. But I'm going to start a bit more with, we're going to start like mid 13th century, all right, and then bring everything up to date. So we talked last time, I mentioned how the Reconquista, that actually had started really starting with the 11th century, how the Christian rulers, again, they're not unified yet at all. That won't be until the 15th century, but they're approximately about 5 areas of Spain, and they gradually will reconquer. That's what Reconquista is. They will reconquer Muslim territories and now make them Christian. So they're going to gradually push further and further south until just literally, as we enter into the early 14th century, how the Muslims are going to be concentrated just in Granada, and with Alhambra palaces, which I heard is really gorgeous. So I've seen pictures, but I've never been there. So my son Shalom has actually taken a few trips to Spain because he like concentrates in certain areas, and he sees those towns, and and then he'll take a trip maybe a year later, and he'll go to another section. And that's why I'm going to have him talk about Portugal, because he has been to Portugal. He's actually led a tour group to Portugal, and he's very well versed. And the first Jews who will come to England, they are descendants of those original Portuguese Jews. So just that's why he's so very familiar with this all. Okay, so again, the Reconquista begins about in that 11th century, but by the year 1248, right? So that's why I say it's like mid 13th century. Most of Spain has now been conquered by these more northern provinces, and the bulk of Spain is now Christian. Now it's interesting. Remember, we had already heard, that life was becoming increasingly difficult for the Jews actually in the Muslims' lands, and many of them had moved northward. And of course, as they reconquer more and more, it's actually interesting. I don't know can you see my map? So some of the major cities, okay, they're actually in the southern part of Spain. I'll just say their names, and that's Seville, Cordova. These were major, Jewish centers. Maybe this map is not totally correct. I don't know. It's from Martin Gilbert, one of his maps. I had to look at on an actual atlas. But a lot of, which had been Muslim town, had been ruled over by Muslims, and the Jews in the Great Heights there. So actually, as they move further south, the Jews will be going and living there as well. All right. Toledo is sort of, I think this is not to scale because I've seen pictures. Madrid is sort of like in the center of Spain. Toledo is further south. So just so you know that. But those were the main, so in that more southerly area. So I would say the cities of Seville, Cordova, and Toledo, they are the key Jewish communities. I mean, they're in other areas. And then in the north, the main center will be Barcelona, which is northeast, and Barcelona is right on the Mediterranean. All right. That's my dream, to go on a cruise, that will leave from Barcelona. You go there a few days in advance, so you tour that city in advance, and then it goes, well, we can go as far as Rome, but I take one that would go all the way to Venice, if I could. A dream of mine, some year. Okay. All right. Again, so the Christian, are going further south and conquering more and more towns and territories, they're now going to acquire a very sizable Jewish population. Now, there already are Jews up north. I mean, even the Rambam, when he left, and he's just 15 years old, and his family initially does go to northern Spain, but they're not happy there, and then they leave. But there are many Jews living in those few towns I had just mentioned to you. And just like when the Muslims first conquered Spain, they made use of the Jews who were living there, who also then immigrated to live there, because conditions initially were very good under the Muslims. And they're going to elevate them, a lot of them, to high positions. This is a very well-educated people. They have good connections, trade-wise, and through finance, and they're going to utilize the Jews. So initially, even though later on I'm going to see how terrible it will be for the Jews under Christian domination, but initially they're very happy to make use of these Jews and use them on behalf of the government. And many of them did rise to positions of great influence, just like they had under Muslim Spain. And if we compare it, to what's going on in France and Germany, at this mid-juncture point, right, of initial, Christian rule, things are good. And actually things like in France and Germany, he learned how they just progressively got worse and worse. But for a time period, for, maybe 100 years or so, we could say, maybe a little bit less than that, the Jews fared okay under Christian rule. They needed the Jews' goodwill, their connections that they had, and actually, it has come down to us with no documents. Jews actually fought in their armies, and they actually then even fought in the armies in battles against Muslims. So it showed you how well entrenched they were with the Christian rulers. But we're talking about more an association again with the higher ups. But people in the middle class or the lower class, they resented the Jews. I think they felt they were usurping, some of their prior powers. They viewed them certainly as competition. And they didn't take too highly, to the Jews gradually seem to be getting more and more influence, in the Christian Spanish government. And of course, a nobleman, then, as the Jews, and again, not everybody is wealthy, but, as some people became very prominent and did become wealthy, obviously there was a lot of resentment that was generated. So just like happened up in Northern Europe, the alliance between the Jew and the ruler was a very important one, because the Jews would be bringing income or be giving advice to the king. But in turn, the king would protect them, all right, up to a certain point. And so they actually, because we were considered as outcasts, we weren't totally integrated into society. So, a lot of Jews were put into administrative positions. They would become the tax collectors. Who likes the tax collector? We don't have an IRS person knocking on our doors. Right, you have to write a check out, to pay your taxes, and this is how they made use of the Jews, and again, that's why we know that there already was hatred within the church, obviously directed against the Jews and the people. They would hear the sermons every Sunday, when they went to church, talking about how evil and terrible the Jews were, and just think about all those terrible anti-Semitic tropes that we had learned about, the desecration of the host. That's that little wafer that they think is the body of Christ. Obviously, the bloodline. They are certainly familiar. They're when I was reading, I don't think that these accusations are actually being used against the Jews in Spain, but they are certainly well aware of them. All right. And obviously they're going to view Jews in a very, very, very negative. I would say by the 13th century, the end of that 13th century, the Reconquista, right, is basically complete. And then we're going to start seeing a gradual change, in the position of the Jews. So first, initially they're being utilized, right, by the monarchs, several. Remember, there were several who ruled over Spain, and they were sort of in a protected, climate there. But things are obviously unfortunately, going to change. So the first thing that we will see, where Jews are going to be put upon and set up to, an antagonistic role is that disputation with the Ramban, which took place in Barcelona, and that was in the year 1263. And that was that public disputation. It was called, was in Aragon. That's where Barcelona, I'm not sure, Catalonia, I believe, is north of Aragon, all right? But in that area so northeastern Spain, that's Aragon, and they had to hold this public disputation. We learned about this, and the person representing the Christian side was an apostate. I mean, we're going to see as we go through these, next century and a half, the terrible positions that these apostates took. I mean, it was really awful how they. So I don't know how they went to sleep at night, the terrible, terrible harm they caused to their former co-religionists. I mean, they were raised within the Jewish community, and were educated there, and then to convert. So it's one thing, fine, because okay, do you want to convert? You think or maybe you think it's safer for yourself personally to become a Christian, but then to turn against, your former friends and relatives. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine. I don't know. Maybe at the end of their lives they regretted what they did. I don't know, but whatever. So, okay, so it's between the Ramban's, the spokesperson on behalf of the Jewish delegation, and this Pablo Cristiani, this former Jew, this apostate, represented. And the goal was, what was the point of this disputation? It'd be another famous disputation coming up in the next century. Because they wanted to show the validity, the truth of the Christian way of life. And in their minds, that they were going to bring up such amazing arguments. Well, then, of course, all the Jews will then convert to Christianity. So that was their mindset, at that time. I did mention to you that the Ramban, it was so eloquent, and also, obviously, this was a different type of king in those days. So this James I, he actually rewarded him, he gave him the prize, as being the best debater. But in the end, still publicly, the Christians had won. That's how it worked. And so there's quite a bit of literature that comes out of this time period. With the arguments that the Jews presented, and obviously the church had their own arguments as well. I want to pause here before I go. I just want to tell you about one key Rav from this period. So this will be after the Ramban goes. So we're going now into the latter half of the 13th century, the very beginning of the 14th century. What do you think? No. You hear a noise coming from here? Oh, I'm so sorry. No, I don't know. It's quiet here.
Okay.
So I don't know.
No, I don't hear anything.
This was, as I say, I lost my original connection. She sent me a new one just today, and it's obviously not working very well. So I'm so sorry. Again, if any of you have the original link, if I didn't give you just the number, if I gave you the original link that I got from Torah Or, if you could send it back to me, so those would be, I don't, if like Karen, I don't know if I sent that original one to you, but those of you who are from Torah Or, if you have my original link, if you could send it back to me, that would be great. Because that one was a good, clear one. And I could also hear you guys. And now I cannot hear you at all.
It's on the Torah.
So can you understand me? Oh, okay. As long as you understand me. Okay. So the very, very great Rabbanim from this time period, again, so we're mostly talking about that latter half of the 13th century and a little bit into the 14th century, was the Rashba. We did mention him before when I was talking about that awful, awful controversy over learning and studying the works of the Ramban, specifically his Moreh Nevuchim. The Rashba was one of those scholars who sort of tempered everything and sort of came up with a compromise. Some of them wanted to totally ban the study of any of the Rambam's, works. He obviously saw, the brilliance of the Rambam and that it was okay. But he was one who said, okay, not till you're 25 should you learn any of the Rambam's philosophical works, which is mostly Moreh Nevuchim. And that then became, the modus vivendi then for years after. And he obviously personally did not approve of the study of philosophy. We're talking about general philosophy. I'm not talking about Jewish philosophy per se, but general philosophy, because there was this potential threat that it could dissuade, especially the younger people, from studying Torah, devoting too much time to philosophy, secular studies. Okay, remember, medicine, astronomy, those were always okay to study because they somehow enhance your understanding of not the Torah, but of the Talmud. Okay. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a little backdrop. We had mentioned Rashba, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him. So his actual name from his the initials is Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderes or Aderat, from ways of pronouncing it, and he lived from the years 1235 until 1310. He was the Rav of Barcelona for 40 years. It's quite a long time. But he was a man of such great scholarship, and he obviously conducted himself in such a wonderful fashion. He became literally the leader of all Spanish Jewry in this era. He himself had learned under the Ramban, right? And also this other Rav, we mentioned him before, sorry, about Yonah of Gerona, just to know about that. We have a lot of his responsa that have come down to us through the ages, literally thousands of his responsa. And he also wrote a commentary on the Gemara. Joel didn't have time to look it up for me, but he's not like on the basic page. There will be a later great Rav who actually is on the page of a printed Gemara, but he's probably like in the back of it or something, and you can learn his commentary then there. Or I'll ask Yechiel. Yechiel seems to know the answer, to all these things. This I found so interesting when I was doing the research. He was actually consulted by a lot of Christian scholars. I guess they recognized his brilliance, how well he knew his Bible, right? So they wanted to know his slant, his interpretation, and then maybe they incorporated that in some of their writings. And again, he's recognized not just as this brilliant scholar, but he is a communal leader. And it says actually, so Allah Esther, who we just sort of talked about. But because of his contacts and the great respect he had, look, obviously even in Christian circles, so he did, from time to time, he was able to voice his opposition to perhaps any decrees that might have come out that would have been antithetical to the Jewish population, and they listened to him. All right. Now, this I found really interesting. Now, during this time period, and it's going to go all the way up into the 17th, 18th century, there were a lot of Nevi'ei Sheker, all right? These are called false messiahs. But I was, they proclaim themselves as the be of the Mashiach, and all these wonderful things are about to happen, and all the Jews we can pick ourselves up and we can all go back and return to live in the land of Israel. So this occurred like periodically through these centuries. But obviously, the great Rabbanim always, pointed out, all the fallacy in the arguments of these Nevi'ei Sheker. And part of the problem, remember we did that unit on the Kabbalah, the problem was actually that became a very detrimental influence. They studied the Kabbalah, and then all of a sudden I went to their heads, that they will now bring about this great redemption. And so times were bad. And even if you go back to those very early days of the Roman times in Judea, obviously everyone knows about Jesus, but there were many, many false messiahs that did exist in that first century CE. And again, because there's such an oppressive rule on the people, so you're always looking for some miraculous savior, who's going to rise in prominence and lead you to victory and freedom, et cetera, et cetera. So the same thing happens, right, during the Rashba's time period, and this is the name of that individual. His name was Rav Avraham Abulafia, and his dates are 1240 to 1293. Now, some of the dates are approximate because you don't know 100%, but obviously he lived, in that latter half of that 13th century. And again, so part of his preaching was, the Mashiach is about to arrive, and obviously he thought himself was the Mashiach. Apparently he was very charismatic, and many, many, many people followed him. He had a lot of disciples. And he actually wrote himself various commentaries or his ideas. And you can actually find them in Kabbalistic works that obviously would have been printed, after him. But you can see what a prominent individual he was and why he had so many followers. He traveled throughout Spain, Italy. He went to Sicily, preaching, that he's a Mashiach. He's about to lead the Jews to total redemption. Now, get a load of this. He gets it into his head in the year 1280. He's going to go to Rome because he is going to convince the Pope, his name was Nicholas III, that he should convert to Judaism. Now you can imagine how well received he was. I thought, who's this idiot coming around to tell me, the Pope, that I should convert? So he was obviously arrested. He was condemned to death, for the audacity that he had to think that he's going to, convert the Pope. And ultimately, the Pope dies, and he's released from prison. I forget, this guy's such a crazy person. He's not harmful. So they just released him and let him go. So he eventually leaves Rome. He settles in Messina, Sicily, for a while, and then eventually he moves to Greece, and apparently he dies there in Greece. That's why I said we don't know 100%, when he passed away. So now this is all occurring during the time that the Rashba, right, is the chief Rav, so to speak, of Spain. And believe you me, he came out with plenty of, either through writings or certainly speeches that he might have given, rebuking this Abulafia. And he says, and telling Jews throughout Spain, do not follow this man. Again, he is a false Messiah. Now again, he obviously did have followers, otherwise it wouldn't have been necessary for him to speak or write against this man. And he was also concerned because the idiot who went to Rome, thinking that he's going to convert, the Pope. He felt that at this time period, conditions, in Spain between the Jews, and the general population, things are fairly stable. And thought, with this nut running around, it's going to cause harm to the Jewish community. It's not just an internal Jewish affair, but the animosity of the Christians are going to rise to the fore now, and it's going to have terrible, effect on the position of the Jews of Spain. And eventually, because again, the Rosh is such a highly respected person, obviously, and then look what happened with his Abulaf. In any case, he had left Spain and he was wandering around in Italy. So eventually, obviously, the Rashba's, writings and speeches, had an effect on the Jews of Spain. They no longer, paid attention to Abulafia. But again, we'll see throughout the next centuries, again, because especially as life will increasingly become more and more difficult and harsh under Christian rule, you always hope that there will be this savior who will come and take you to some glorious future, which is not too far away, right? Because this is the Mashiach talking to you, it caused, there was a lot of havoc there. I'm just trying to understand, the terrible conditions in which the Jews found themselves, certainly then too a bit, but certainly later on. And so they're always looking for this miraculous person who's going to come and lead them to safety. Okay. And again, I think that the Rashba was also so worried about, which will occur certainly later on, like the time period with the Shavtai Tzvi, remember talking about in the 1600s, not 17th century, is that, when the people will finally realize that this is a false Messiah and he's not going to save you, he's that good times are not just around the corner, the terrible disillusionment that the Jews will find themselves in. And that later, Rabbanim and then scholars, even at a later age, looking back at it, they think that's why so many of the Jews of Spain actually ultimately did convert to Christianity because they just had lost all hope. Again, there was nobody was going to save them, when the Christians came upon them and said, either, convert, or be slaughtered. And many of them did ultimately, unfortunately, convert. Okay. Meanwhile, to just explain what's going on among the Jewish population. So this is the time period again, when the Jews have already been expelled from England. They're now going to be expelled from France 3 times, but the final major one. And then we had learned the terrible things that were happening to the Jews in Germany and even Austria, and even in parts of Bohemia, Moravia. So a lot of these Jews will now find their way. They will go to Spain, because again, at this point, on a relative, comparing it, to how difficult, how horrible their lives were in France, and then in Germany, and some of those other countries in Central Europe. So they think, life is better from Spain. So we're going to get an influx gradually of these French and then later these German Jews who will come to actually live in Spain. All right, let me make sure it's anybody else. So I just want to talk there's one very great Rav, but I think I may do him next time. So they're just 2 particular Rabbanim, again, still within that, that end of that 13th century, very, very beginning 14th century, both who are disciples of Rashba. And so I just wanted to mention their names to you. And one is the Ritva. His actual name is Rabbi Yom Tov Asavili, because he came from Seville. I thought, remember we learned about the Jews of Provence, how so many of their last names are based on the towns, where they actually live. So here's a man from Seville. Apparently he too wrote a commentary on the Talmud, and apparently we do have it has survived to this day. He also wrote a defense of the Rambam, of his, his rationalistic approach, to how you interpret the Torah. So obviously opposed, some of the Rambam's, some of the writings of the Ramban at a later date, but he personally, I guess, did not care for a rationalistic approach. Remember, the Ramban was very influenced by Kabbalah. And apparently, he was a brilliant scholar, and he lived in, even though I told you he comes from Seville, that's where his last name is, but he learned in the yeshiva in Barcelona, right, of whom initially the Rashba is the head of, and apparently he was a mentor to many, many others of Rashba's students. The other person whose name I just wanted to mention to you, who actually comes from Saragossa, so we have a different town, and Saragossa is also, it's to the west of Barcelona, but it's in northern Spain. And his name is it's called Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher. He wrote a book called Midrash Rabbeinu Bachya, which is a super commentary. When I use that term, super commentary, it's not just that they're writing a commentary on the actual words, let's say in Chumash, they are writing the commentary on the commentaries of others, So, they will study the words and the ideas in Rashi or Ramban or Ibn Ezra, and they're going to write then, so to speak, a commentary on those writings. All right. Apparently he began, each of his interpretations. So he arranged it, by Sedra, according, to each Shabbos, what we read in Shul. But he would always introduce each of these areas where he had an introduction. It took a quote from Mishlei, from Proverbs, and then there he would elaborate, as he went further on. He does have Kabbalistic ideas in his writings. So obviously that's why he was influenced by the Ramban. And it was, so it's a way of understanding what did the Ramban write, what was his intention, and then this man, right, this Rabbeinu Bachya, he's now going to add an extra interpretation based on the Ramban's writings. Apparently he also wrote a book on ethics, which he talked about the importance, belief, trust in Hashem, and observance of the mitzvot. Now, there's one other very, very great Rav, but he lives a bit more to the 14th century, so I thought maybe I'll hold off on talking about him until we talk more about the 14th century. So, right, so let me just make sure I have everything in place here. Okay, so let me put this. All right, now let's go back to that 14th century. Make sure I have everything here. Okay, it's interesting. I noticed that a lot of the problems will sometimes start in Castile. Okay, so Castile is more like central Spain, and Aragon is more northeast. The problems will often start in Castile and then spread to Aragon afterwards. I'm not sure exactly why this happened. Obviously, there was more anti-Jewish sentiment in Castile. And I think later, like when you think about the 15th century or the latter half of the 15th century, and we're talking about Isabella and who comes from Castile. And so maybe she grew up, again, she's not living at all in the 14th century, you know, she won't be born into the into the 15th century, but she's obviously living in this environment, this very antagonistic Jewish, anti-Jewish sentiment, that arose at Castile. And Ferdinand, he's from Aragon. I think he just goes along with her at the end. He's looking for the wealth, what's going to be confiscated from the Jews, and that's what motivates him, ultimately for what will lead to the expulsion. But she's really motivated by these deeply religious Christian, leanings. So again, I just think perhaps coming from Castile, perhaps this sort of influenced her mindset. Okay. So when we're going to talk about, the beginning of the 14th century, things are like so, nothing great, but they're okay. But then there's a civil war that's going to break out because there's going to be a big dispute between two half-brothers within the royal family, and they're each of them going to claim that they are the next king. And one of them is called Pedro, is actually known sometimes as Pedro the Cruel, and the other is Henry II. Initially, Pedro will be the ruler for about 10 years, but there's going to be this awful civil war that's going to go on, and eventually Henry II will be the ruler. And the Jews, unfortunately, picked the wrong person to back. They back Pedro. So by the time Henry, finally becomes the victor, boy, there'll be this awful unleashment of anti-Semitic, terrible anti-Semitic attacks upon the Jews. Now, again, I got this from Rabbi Wine's book. It's interesting insight. I didn't see it in a lot of the other sources that he feels that the papacy was very weak during this time period, during the 14th century. There was what's called the Great Schism. There are actually, at this point, there are two popes. So there's no one person wielding great power. Obviously, there is a pope in Rome, but there is also a pope in Avignon in France, and that's because the king of France is becoming more powerful and he backs this man, whatever. And there's even going to be a time period where there were 3 popes. So he feels that is why Spain sort of developed independently. Very often, the popes would be like a moderating influence within the church. And you would think, he's the head of Christendom, but he actually, would generally treated the Jews, in a much more of, was a milder form, of antagonism. But in Spain, it's going to go rampant, and it's going to be specifically the Franciscan and the Dominican Rite monks. They're going to be at the forefront of all these terrible anti-Semitic attacks upon the Jews. Okay, so now let me go back to this civil war. It actually started in 1355, and it goes actually all the way to 1369. Because I told you initially Pedro is the ruler, but then Henry's forces will overcome him, and in the end, actually Henry's going to kill his own I'm not sure he's a half brother or step brother. I've seen both things, listed. So, but somehow they were brothers that were related in some fashion or other. And they obviously both were pretenders to the throne. Let me just make sure. So I told you initially, unfortunately, the Jews backed the wrong person. They backed Pedro. So when Henry went out to battle to fight against this, half brother or step brother, whatever he is, he had this like battle cry. And what was it? Recapture Castile from the Jews. So first of all, there's already this anti-Semitic undercurrent among the populace. So to garner, more support for his side, he's going to be appealing to this ugly undercurrent, right? And, they're going to make, oh, you're for Pedro? Then you're for the Jews, so they, but I'm this wonderful Christian, person. I have nothing to do with the Jews. So you side with me, the battle will be against those evil, terrible Jews. And wherever he went throughout, Castile, trying to drum up support, he's always going to bring up this ugly, argument about, this is a battle to reclaim, our land for the Christians, against those Jews. And of course, as they went about doing this, there were these awful attacks upon the Jewish communities in Seville itself. Let me see. So again, told you original. For the first 10 years, Pedro, is successful, and he holds back, his brother's attempts, and he tries to save the Jewish communities from his rule. But again, I told you, ultimately, Henry, he's called Henry II, will be the victor, and thousands of Jews met their death at this time period. And once in 1369, when the Civil Wars finally come again, so now even the Jews formerly, they had sort of a favored status, politically, with the monarch, and it's now going to totally come to an end. And now all these awful restrictions will come upon the Jews. In the end, though, he too will start utilizing a lot of these, Jewish courtiers, people with the knowledge for finance and government. He will incorporate them. But already, you can see the tone is changing in Spain, and now it's becoming more acceptable that it's okay to attack the Jews and murder them. All right, let me see what else. Now we're going to go to this. This is, so to speak, the next thing we're going to talk about. This is the beginning of the end for Spanish Jewry, and occurs in the year 1391. So remember that date. Should I just go back and maybe just start telling you about that other Rav, because he had an early influence before I do 1391. So let me go back and just tell you about the next very, very great Rav. And his name is the Rush. Okay, it's actually spelled like Roche, but it's pronounced Rush. I mean, Joel corrected me because I wasn't sure exactly. And he is, his real name is Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel, and he lived from 1250 to 1327. And he was a German Jew. He had lived in Cologne. The great Rav at this time period was Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. Remember, that was the story. Remember, he becomes incarcerated, and he won't let anybody bail him out because he doesn't want to set a precedent that after this everybody will want to make that think that it's okay. That they can kidnap any Jew they want and demand a ransom, and the Jews will always somehow come up with the funds to have this person released. So he said he's remained in prison. And remember, I had mentioned to you that a lot of some of his disciples would literally come to the prison. I don't know, they got in or through a window, and they would learn Torah with him, and then they would write down his various pronouncements. And this Rush was a key disciple of this Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. Apparently he was considered, even while still living in Germany, he was known to be a great Talmudist. But again, obviously times are turning bad, and he's going to eventually leave, and he's going to come to reside in Spain, where conditions are a lot more, at that point, favorable to the Jews. Again, this is even before that civil war that I just mentioned to you. All right, let me go on. Okay, so again, he is a German Jew. He views himself as a spiritual heir to this Rabbi Meir. So he's very much been influenced by the German Jewish way of learning. But when he comes to Barcelona, already has a name for himself. He obviously, meets the Rashba, and he then helps set him up as, finds, so to speak, a job for him. He becomes the chief rabbinic judge and rabbi of Toledo. All right, so he's coming about, we're talking about a little bit like South Central Spain, right, leaving Barcelona in the northeast. And so a lot of the Ashkenazic customs and the Ashkenazic Jewish way of life are now going to be introduced to the Jews of Spain, and some of the ideas will become incorporated actually in the Sephardic life. Again, he was a strong personality, this brilliant Talmudic scholar, a great authority on halacha, and obviously also a very, very great leader. And so Jews throughout, obviously Spain, Germany, Provence, North Africa, they're all going to be receiving, his response and knowing about them, and he becomes the next very great leader after the Rashba. Just a general things before I tell you a little bit more, what he's most famous for is he obviously backed those who opposed the study of philosophy. Remember, I told you, in France and Germany, they didn't study philosophy. It wasn't part of their curriculum, so to speak. So he was very much opposed to, again, the study of philosophy. One should just devote himself to studying the Jewish texts, and that's it. Or obviously there's some famous Jewish philosophical writings, but not to study general philosophy at all. And obviously he's still highly respected by the Spanish Jews, even though that was their leaning to study philosophy, and they thought that was okay, it was very acceptable. But again, because of his, I think, the strength of his personality, that's why he rises to become a prominent leader of Spanish Jewry. He is most famous. I looked it up. I fact checked. Joel has one of these gigantic Gemaras. It's how they used to be published before Art Scroll. They started, coming out with the smaller ones. And he has his own Tosfos commentary. Really, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg is considered the last of the Tosfos, but he learned under him. So he is actually on a page of a Gemara. Now, you're not going to find it on a smaller Gemara, but, on the very, very large page, you will find him. And it's called Tosfei Harush. All right. I saw where it's actually printed. And it goes throughout all the various tractates of the Gemara, and he always gives the sources for decisions. So he's like a good source to look at to find out what is the actual halacha. The Gemara itself is just discussions. You can study them and you won't know necessarily what the law is, but this is what he's starting to write down. So it's considered to be a very authoritative legal code. And it becomes binding then on all Spanish Jewry, all the way up until the time of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch will supplant. We're going to learn about some additional great Rabbonim who wrote halachic works and various codes of Jewish law, but the Shulchan Aruch will become the ultimate source. Okay, so I just wanted to conclude with him. Next time I'll tell you about another great Rav that will, I want to mention him before I come to that 1391. 1391 will conclude with that 14th century. So I hope that by next time I can, we'll be able to correct this, because it's annoying not to be able to interface with you guys. All should just be good. Again, you should have a most happy Purim Sameach. Yes, Chag Sameach. Thank you. And just just enjoy
Pray like a
be very
Purim, pray
quiet
like a
for it in a
Purim.
way because, we're kind of a Seudah on this. Yes, thank you, my pleasure. And as again, if any of you have that original, those of you especially from Torah, or if you have the original thing that was sent out to make the link, I don't know, or I can ask Andrea in the office. She sent me an extra link today because I couldn't find my original one. But you see, obviously, I can't communicate with you, so it's a little frustrating. All right. Be well. Again, stay healthy, and
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Pray like a Purim.